Thank you. Thanks. Okay, sit down. Thank you very much. That's really kind of you. Yeah, I was just talking to people at the breakout session on media. I had a problem getting here yesterday, or getting to Madison yesterday. My flight was canceled, and of course, it's very hard to find direct flights to Madison from New York. There's like 2 of them now, or something like that a day. Anyway, my flight got canceled. I had to fly to Milwaukee. I got a rental car, and I met up with my good friend Norm Stockwell from WORT, and he was with Greg Pallas last night, and it was sort of bizarre. I was hoping the cops weren't watching because we met in a parking lot, and it looked like a strange scene. Something was untoward was happening, and Norm with that beard. Anyway, we were there. We go out. We talk for a while, and then I'm driving Greg Pallas back to the hotel, and we turn onto East Washington and immediately get pulled over by the police. So Blackwater is in town, and so we get pulled over, and the officer comes up, and I give him my New York license and the registration for the rental car, and he said, well, you're out of state, so to process this, I'm probably going to have to take you in. I said, oh. And I didn't want to get into it. My plane was canceled, blah, blah, blah. And I just said, officer, I just got into town. And he goes, well, what are you in town for? And I said, I'm speaking at a festival tomorrow. And he goes, oh, what festival? And I said, Fighting Bob Fest. And he goes, okay, I'll tell you what, I'm just going to give you a warning. Now, I've covered police brutality and police misconduct, and I would never co-sign any one police department's presence in a community. I know that there are serious problems with police brutality and harassment and other issues, but I do have to say that I find it hard to believe that in many communities in this country it would be a positive to tell the police that you're going to Fighting Bob Fest, but such is the nature of things, I guess, with some police officers in Madison. So thank you, officer, whatever your name was, I really appreciate it. I'm sure many of you are aware that there is a gathering of insane people happening in Washington right now. The teabaggers are in Washington en masse. And before I came here today, I was watching the corporate media on television, and they're doing like wall-to-wall coverage of. To call it a protest is sort of like calling Glenn Beck a journalist. It's just not true. But they're doing wall-to-wall coverage, and they're interviewing people, and they have helicopter views, and they're letting these people go on and on with their crazy AstroTurf-inspired, sentiments or what have you. And I'm just stepping back from that and thinking, where was all this media coverage when there were millions upon millions of people in the streets saying no to the war in Iraq? The coverage of dissent in this country before the teabaggers was basically non-existent. Protesters were to be seen if there was any coverage, but never heard unless they were screaming something unintelligible. And they always managed to find the craziest person as a demonstration to speak for the millions of others who were protesting. It's a way of sort of media warfare against dissent. But the fact here, and we know this now in a crystal clear way, although it was clear to many of you, I'm sure, that those people who took to the streets years ago to fight against the war, they were the ones, or you were the ones, that got it right. The media, they got it wrong. Those people in Washington today, they continue with their lies. That shows you the priorities in this country. Who gets coverage, who doesn't? Well, we could say that for healthcare too, but who gets the microphone and who doesn't? And then the other night we have Obama giving his speech. You notice every time that Obama speaks about healthcare, something happens that then turns into the side game. It was Gates before in his arrest, and then at this one it's that loony bin Representative Joe Wilson. There were 2 Joe Wilsons that called presidents liars recently, and one of them was right. And that was Ambassador Joe Wilson, who wrote the op-ed questioning the underlying rationale being given for the invasion of Iraq. But at the same time, the Democrats were up in arms, and they want Joe Wilson to apologize, and they're going to have a resolution against him, and that's all well and good. But I just wonder, have any of these people ever watched the British Parliament on C-SPAN, where like objects are being thrown at the Prime Minister? I mean, toughen up a bit here, please. Toughen up. And I was thinking, if somebody yelled, "You lie," during Bush's State of the Union address, we would still be watching his first address because he wouldn't have been able to finish because every word he spoke was a lie. And I wish that the Democrats had disrupted President Bush's lie-riddled speeches instead of voting with him to authorize funds for this illegal and immoral war. You know, right now as we speak, President Obama continues on the path that the Bush administration laid out in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. Well, you could say that it was laid out before that with the Project for a New American Century and their vision for a remaking of the maps in the Middle East and the reorganizing of the priorities around the world and borders, etc. But Obama is not only continuing with an escalation of the war in Afghanistan, but also is sustaining the occupation of Iraq. And in both cases, he's continuing a radical privatization agenda that began under Clinton and George H.W. Bush and then was put on steroids under President Bush and co-President Cheney. And what we are seeing right now is a reality where there are about 500,000 US-funded personnel operating in Iraq, Afghanistan, and in some other countries in a support capacity for those two wars. And of those 500,000 personnel that are on the US government payroll, a full 50% of them are private contractors, as they're called. Now, I have an uncle who's a contractor and he does construction. That's what I normally think of when I think of a contractor. Somehow the language has been twisted and changed so that mercenaries are now referred to as contractors. In Afghanistan, for both the second and third quarters of this year, the Obama administration has increased dramatically the presence of armed contractors in Afghanistan, and they've also increased them in Iraq. Blackwater continues to be on the US government payroll armed in Iraq, and 2 weeks ago the State Department confirmed that they don't have an actual end date now for Blackwater's work in Iraq. This despite the fact that this company has 5 men who've been indicted on manslaughter charges for massacring Iraqi civilians in Baghdad's Nisr Square. A 6th has pled guilty. The company is under investigation by the Internal Revenue Service. They're under congressional investigation. The Justice Department is investigating them. There are grand juries, allegations of weapons smuggling. Former employee of Eric Prince, the owner of Blackwater, saying in a sworn affidavit that Eric Prince views himself as a Christian crusader tasked with eliminating Muslims and destroying Islam globally. That's the man on President Obama's payroll right now. And it's not just working in Iraq and Afghanistan in an armed capacity where they work for both the State Department and the Pentagon under various names. You know, they were Blackwater, and then they were Z, XE. Now they've changed it. If you think their name is Z, you're so last week. It's U.S. Training Center is now the new name that Blackwater goes under. It sounds like somewhere Dan Jansen would go to learn how to ice skate better or something, the U.S. Training Center. I talked to Ralph Nader the other day, and he said that he thinks that it's illegal for them to even use that name because it gives the impression that they're the U.S. government. I think that Blackwater's corporate charter should be challenged. They've lost their right to exist in this country for the crimes that they've committed. But it's not just in Iraq and Afghanistan working for the Department of Defense and the State Department. Blackwater, we now know in a very clear way, has been a part of the CIA's secret assassination program for years. I wrote in my book how Blackwater got its first CIA contract. A man named Alvin Buzzy Krongard, who was the number 3 man at the Central Intelligence Agency, was a friend of Eric Prince's father, Edgar. And he met with Eric Prince at the compound of Blackwater in April of 2002 in Moyock, North Carolina, and they developed a covert arrangement in the immediate aftermath of US invasion of Afghanistan to insert a small team of Special Forces operators off the public radar on a CIA contract to work with the Central Intelligence Agency in Kabul and in a town called Shkin, which is along the Afghan-Pakistan border. That began Blackwater's work with the Central Intelligence Agency, and then beginning in 2004, although I think it may have been before that, Blackwater was hired as part of the secret assassination program that Dick Cheney, we understand, withheld from the United States Congress. So we have a man who has been identified as a former person in management as his company, as a Christian crusader who believes that his job in the world is to kill Muslims and destroy Islam on the US government payroll in a Muslim country that the Obama administration has characterized as a war of necessity and at times a war of liberation. Such is the state of the change that you can believe in when it comes to the policy of private contractors and privatization of the war agenda. 74,000 contractors in Iraq right now, 62,000 US troops. that means that you now have more corporate forces deployed on the ground in Afghanistan than you have uniformed members of the United States military. And this is a trend that is only continuing, only becoming more radical as the days go by. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, when she was running for president, said that she would, if elected, move to ban Blackwater and other private military companies from operating in U.S. war zones, saying that they would not be allowed to perform inherently governmental functions. Now, one could reasonably confront her with the idea that an assassination program is any kind of a government function that the people of this country would support, but that perhaps is a debate for another day. But the fact is that Hillary Clinton now, as Secretary of State, is the single official that could cancel all of these contracts. They work under the U.S. State Department. Hillary Clinton is presiding over a policy where the use of these companies is expanding, not being reduced. I give Senator Bernie Sanders tremendous credit for being the sole sponsor of the legislation in the Congress that sought to ban these companies. When Hillary Clinton signed on, as the only other co-sponsor in the Senate to Senator Sanders' legislation, he sponsored it in the Senate, Jan Schakowsky sponsored it in the House, Hillary Clinton became the single most important political figure in the United States to call for a ban on these companies, and she has swiftly turned her back on that pledge that she made to her voters 5 days before the Texas and California primaries. After Obama had said he wouldn't ban them, she took that position. It's not just that she's presiding over an expansion of this, she and Obama, but we now understand that at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan, private contractors working for a company called Armor Group, which is owned by Wackenhut, the massive company that does private prisons and other private so-called security in the United States, that these individuals were running hazing operations like a bunch of frat boys outside of U.S. Embassy, forcing new recruits to drink urine off of the buttocks of another contractor, fondling each other's genitals, drinking until they would pass out, acting like they were at some kind of a frat house party when their job on a $180 million contract is to guard U.S. civilian diplomats at the embassy in Kabul. What we now know, and this is on the front page of the New York Times today, is that these individuals, their misconduct has been known since at least 2007 to the United States State Department, and yet they continue to renew the contracts for these individuals. That company still is guarding U.S. diplomats in Kabul. Those problems, that misconduct that I just described, is one area in a sea of misconduct and criminal activity being committed with hundreds of millions of dollars in taxpayer money in Afghanistan right now. In Iraq, we have Blackwater, Triple Canopy, DynCorp, Armor Group, and others on the U.S. government payroll. We spend $2.5 billion every week on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and 25 to 40 cents on every dollar goes to private corporations. I have a simple question for any lawmaker in this country. How on earth do you justify spending billions of dollars on these companies that benefit from a worsening of war, who are not held to the same standards as U.S. troops, and you can't provide adequate health care for every single person in this country? How do you justify that? How do you justify Democratic Party having on the payroll individuals who the United States Justice Department says are in Iraq to kill Muslims as, quote, payback for 9/11? As though there ever was a connection between Iraq and 9/11, there wasn't one. The fact is that you have people on the payroll that refer to Muslims as hajis and ragheads that continue to be on the United States government payroll, and we don't have health care for people in this country. Not one dime should be going to Eric Prince's mercenary company ever, not to mention when we don't have health care. In Congress, there are a handful of people that have worked on this issue, Senator Sanders being one of them, Henry Waxman another, Jan Schakowsky. I could probably name them just on my two hands, the number of representatives that have taken this issue seriously. And yet it is one of the premier issues of our time, the radical privatization of every aspect of our life. And we have a cowardly, bankrupt culture of media in this country. where you have the elites like Chuck Todd and Joe Klein acting more like spokespeople for the administration than journalists. When you have journalists, quote unquote, standing outside of the White House and you can't tell if they're Robert Gibbs or Chuck Todd, you know that there is a serious crisis in journalism in this country. You know, I was on Bill Maher's program recently with Chuck Todd. And I said to Chuck Todd in that program, I called him out because he said that the issue of accountability for those who created the torture policy, provided the legal justification for it, and then implemented it on the ground, that the discussion of prosecuting them was, quote, cable catnip. And I called him out on it, and I debated him on that program. And after the show, when we were leaving the set, Chuck Todd came up to me and he said, that was a cheap shot. And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, the whole thing, it was a cheap shot. And I said, well, Chuck, what did I say that wasn't true? And he said, well, that's not the point. And he put his hand on my shoulder. Of course it's not the point to Chuck Todd. And he said, you sullied my reputation on TV. I'll tell you this. There is somebody who sullied Chuck Todd's reputation on TV, and his name is Chuck Todd, by not being a real journalist when this country desperately needs real journalism. I also asked him, why is it that Helen Thomas is the only journalist that asks good questions, important questions on a regular basis? I don't know how old Helen Todd is, but she's the only journalist sitting there day in, day out at those press briefings. We have hit an all-time low. I feel like I could give this part of the speech every year. We've hit an all-time low with media in this country, to the point where Joe Klein is off on vacation somewhere whining to somebody about how Glenn Greenwald, the blogger, is evil. And Glenn Greenwald puts civil liberties above national security. And that fool made the mistake of saying it to a blogger who just turned out to be I.F. Stone's granddaughter, who then did the right thing and said to Glenn Greenwald, can I have your response to this? And so now Glenn Greenwald is calling out Joe Klein on a regular basis. We don't have journalists, for the most part, in this society anymore, particularly not on television. We have stenographers for the powerful. That's the role of these individuals. They hang out together. They're friends. Their kids play together. The powerful in the chambers of Congress and the White House and the media celebrities, they're all just friends. And under Obama, it's gotten even grosser because they just really like the guy, and you don't want to step across a line and say something that's going to put you out of favor with the cool kids in town. See, that's the problem with journalism. We're not supposed to be cavorting with the powerful, toasting drinks with them. We're supposed to be holding them accountable. That's our job in this society. I did a couple of stories this past week for The Nation magazine, and I want to share some of this with you because I think it's one of the incredible scandals happening right now in Iraq. 19 soldiers and contractors have been electrocuted in Iraq, 19. There's currently a review of 90,000 facilities that are serviced by the Pentagon's largest contractor, KBR, the former Halliburton subsidiary that was run officially by Dick Cheney during the 90s and then unofficially by him when he was in the White House. They have done the electrical wiring in many of these buildings where individual soldiers or contractors have been electrocuted. The most high profile of these was Sergeant Ryan Maseth, who was a Green Beret that was electrocuted in January of 2008. His mother, Cheryl Harris, has been fighting for justice for her son. When the investigation was done by the military, they declared it a negligent homicide that had been committed against her son, but now they've whitewashed it and the Pentagon says there will be no charges in that case. So I got a message the other day from a 17-year-old kid named Jesse Hermanson, and he sent me an email through Facebook, and he said, my brother just died in Iraq on September 1st, and we're very suspicious about the circumstances under which he died. And I worked with the family and did an investigation, and it turns out that the company he was working for, this was a guy who was a United States Air Force veteran, 6 years in the Air Force, 3 tours in Iraq, 1 in Uzbekistan, had just started working for a private company called Triple Canopy in Iraq, which is the new Blackwater. That's the company that Obama hired to take over much of Blackwater's work in Iraq. And Triple Canopy, by the way, then hired a bunch of the laid-off Blackwater guys. So he was working for Triple Canopy in Baghdad. He's taking a shower at Camp Olympia, the private base in the green zone of Triple Canopy, and he was found dead on the floor, electrocuted. But Triple Canopy, according to the Hermanson family, told them he was found by his bedside. They told him there were no marks on his body. Well, the family got an autopsy done. And the cause of death, the preliminary cause of death, was determined to be low voltage electrocution. We have pictures, and we broadcast them on Democracy Now!, of the severe electrical burns up and down the left arm of this man, Adam Hermanson, who very clearly seems to have been killed in it's hard to call it an accident. He died in a shower because quite likely the wiring was done improperly around the chief. That's what we're seeing over and over again. When I talked to the Department of Defense and I said, are you going to investigate this death? First of all, State Department, Defense Department, none of them would own it. He didn't work for the State Department. He didn't work for the Department of Defense. Finally, the Department of Defense says, yeah, he was working on a contract for us. So I said, so are you investigating? Oh, well, no, it's not under our jurisdiction because he was working for a private company and he died in the green zone. This is a guy who works on a Department of Defense contractor and was 6 years in the military. How is it not the business of the Department of Defense that he's electrocuted in a shower in a green zone filled with swimming pools, cappuccino, Burger King, where troops are getting obese? How is it that you have a combat vet dying in a shower and not in combat, and the Department of Defense says, well, it's not our business? These families of the civilians in Iraq that are killed by Blackwater, and by the U.S. military for that matter, they deserve justice. They deserve their day in court, and they deserve those responsible for their deaths to be held accountable. And the sad reality in our society today, for all the hubbub we hear about trial lawyers and how evil trial lawyers are the only people right now fighting for justice for these victims. They're suing Blackwater, they're suing Triple Canopy, they're suing Titan, they're suing Khaki, they're suing KBR. If we had a spine in the legislature in this country, you wouldn't need trial lawyers to seek justice for these people because the lawmakers would be doing their job and doing it for them. So that's why these trial lawyers are working on these cases. I want to wrap up by saying that we have an anniversary today on September 12th that some people may not be aware of. It's the anniversary of the arrest of the Cuban Five. These are 5 individuals that were sent by the Cuban government into Miami to infiltrate right-wing Cuban communities that had been committing and organizing acts of terrorism against Cuba, and they were falsely arrested on espionage charges. Let's remember, the United States invades countries, has spies all over the globe, allows Mossad operatives from Israel to come inside of the United States and conduct operations. I don't know that there's been a country in the Western Hemisphere in modern times that's been more of a victim of terrorism emanating from the United States in terms of military-style terrorism than the people of Cuba. And so Cuba sends 5 people here to infiltrate and try to gather information, and then they are arrested on espionage charges, and one of the Cuban 5, Fernando Gonzalez, is in prison here in Wisconsin, in Oxford, Wisconsin, and you can go to freethefive.org, spell the whole thing out, freethefive.org, and there's also people passing out information in the back there. I bring that up because I've been to Cuba several times, and I think that we are hypocrites in this country if we are not able to condemn acts of terrorism that emanate from the United States and then have the audacity to accuse anyone else on the planet of committing terrorism against the people of the United States. In closing, I'm going to say this, that I think that it's a sad state of affairs in this country when the Democrats control the Senate, the Democrats control the House, the Democrats control the White House, and they're moving toward controlling the Supreme Court, and we can't get healthcare legislation passed that guarantees it as a basic human right. Nancy Pelosi and the Congress in 2006 had the resounding support of many people in this country to actually change policies, and the first thing she says is impeachment is off the table when she comes into power. Right now, this should be the collective shame of our society that we continue to pay Blackwater mercenaries to murder people, innocent civilians, as part of a Christian crusade, and we can't get single-payer health care in this country. Thank you.